Welcome everyone to this edition of New Humanum. I'm joined today by Robin Aitken, and we're going to be talking to Robin Aitken about his career as a former BBC journalist. But before we go on to that, I think we'll touch on some aspects of your early life and what brought you to where you are today as a person, as an individual, and then we'll explore for a while, maybe Robin, your motivation for getting involved with New Humanum and its implications for today's society.
Certainly, Tony, yes. I mean, what to say? I was reared as a Christian,
Right.
so I was reared as a Catholic from an early age. And as a boy, I was sent to Catholic schools, initially a very conservative, in the old style Catholic school. So I was taught initially by Irishmen in the main, Christian brothers, at a school in Bath. So I was what was known as a cradle Catholic. It's not strictly true actually, because my parents converted when I was about 4, but I don't recall the prior time to that. But so yes, I was brought up as a Catholic and have remained so.
So was there ever a time when it became perhaps more real to you and you embraced it for yourself as opposed to being brought up in the tradition?
Yes, and I think this is a common experience for people. I mean, I think faith can wax and wane, and you know, as somebody once quipped, when I was young and foolish, I was young and foolish. and I certainly went through a period in my 20s when I was not very observant of my faith, and certainly had doubts about it. But I think also, like a lot of other people, there came a point when I had to decide what rules I was going to live by. And did the rules that I'd been brought up with make sense? Or was there a better set of rules which would have suited me better? And so this, I'm talking here about the late 60s, the early 70s.
Right.
So into the 1970s, and these were a time in the country, particularly for young people, it was a time of free expression. Young people felt, I think, freer and more able to go their own way than perhaps previous generations had. And but to me, I think there came a point at which I looked over the edge at that and thought that was chaotic and also, in a way, destructive. And although I don't think I termed it I didn't frame it in quite this way at the time, but now I have come to see that becoming an adult, becoming a mature person, a mature young man, means that you have to embrace self-restraint to a certain extent.
So your faith, you make no bones about the fact that your faith is a key driver of your personality and everything you do in life, and is very important to you. Coming into the present just for a moment, we have a lot of new atheists these days who espouse the Christian ethic as a good model for society, even though they have no faith or belief. So how would you separate maybe your conception of your faith from their perception of a good model for society? How did you go beyond that, if you like?
Well, you touch on something there which I think is of profound importance, because I think if you strip God out of the equation, it's more difficult, indeed impossible, to arrive at what we might call objective truth. So the notion that there is a God in whom you believe and who has set out certain rules and practices which human beings should abide by to lead healthy lives, that gives you a firm foundation for a set of moral standards and beliefs, because you can, for instance, reference back to the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments. You can look at the Sermon on the Mount as God's truth relayed to humankind and passed down through the generations by believing Christians, which is what I believe. And I believe that these rules for living, though applied now in very different times, are still the right rules, the best set of rules to ensure that human beings lead healthy and creative lives. The atheist, on the other hand, doesn't have that foundation. To where does the atheist look for a set of objective truths? There are no such thing. In fact, everybody can have their own set of rules. And who is to say, if one is not a believer, if you strip God out of the equation, who is to say that this is right and that is wrong? In fact, that is the problem, really, in a nutshell. That by discarding the Christian tradition, you actually muddy the waters about what is right and what is wrong. Now, there are some things which society can still agree on, like murder, for instance, I suppose, is a cliche example. So everyone can agree that murder is wrong. But actually, in many other issues, it's not at all clear. And that is why there is so much confusion and chaos out there, moral chaos, in the country, because...
Objective versus subjective
Yes,
morality.
indeed.
And it's interesting to note at that point that if you look globally, of course, what we would call the developed Western nations are actually a minority globally in terms of the number of people and the regimes they live under on the planet. So you can only push the populist opinion argument so far, because once you take, China's massive, other countries are massive, which do and think things very different to what we would call the Western approach, if you like. So, by our very nature, we would argue some form of subjective reality, or objective reality, if you like. But I want to just take a step back, if I can, and just talk about your parents and their influence on you. Larkin famously wrote, "They mess you up, your mum and dad." Didn't use that word, did he? They may not mean to, but they do. They give you all the faults they had and make some new ones just for you.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of what do you remember as key influences from your parents?
Well, I was very lucky because I had two loving parents. Now, they were not particularly strict. My mum was not a strict person. She was a very kind person. I think what I learned from her was the value of kindness. And I think actually kindness is something which is very underrated as a virtue sometimes. When I look at the public discourse in Parliament or in social media, I am horrified by the cruelty that people inflict verbally on each other. My mother would never have made a point really of never speaking ill of people. It might make her sound a bit soap and water, but she wasn't milk and water. I mean, she wasn't at all. She just always tried to see the best in people, even if they were objectionable and difficult, as some people are. My dad, on the other hand, was somebody who, typically of that generation, had lived through the war, had a tough time in certain respects, and in his war service, it hadn't always been easy, had done his duty. And I think he very much saw his role as a father as one of doing his duty by his own lights, which meant putting food on the table and a roof over our heads, and when necessary, disciplining us. But he was not a harsh disciplinarian by any stretch of the imagination. But I think what I took from that upbringing was something which so many young people lack, actually, are role models who were good and kind and just, and they're not always right. Well, that is to say, I used to argue fiercely with my dad at times, and I disappointed him too at times. But you know, what a child gains from an upbringing like that is a very firm foundation, and a firm foundation where you know you're loved and valued, even when you go off the rails and make mistakes. And this is an inestimable, of inestimable value for a youngster.
And does that reflect on their marriage together as well? So
yes.
It was solid, and it
Yes.
was, because it's almost like there's this minimum value below which nothing can drop, because you know there's a commitment to each other as a couple, to you as a child.
Yes.
And nothing drops below a certain value, and that's a safety net, isn't it, which you come to appreciate maybe.
Absolutely.
And an interesting point you mentioned there was your father's obligation. He felt his role was fulfilled by putting food on the table, by being responsible for the family. And it's interesting because Carl Trueman picks up on how man's fulfillment, if you like, has changed from those objective things to a psychologized fulfillment, which then gets sexualized, and the sexualized gets politicized, and the whole thing transforms, and you're fulfilled by expressing yourself, as opposed these days, as opposed to providing for other people, which is your classic upbringing, if you like.
I think that's absolutely true, Tony, and I think that there is a morass out there which people get, particularly young men. It's my belief that it's only by accepting responsibility for others that men come to maturity. So, and there is an epidemic of, you often read this, you know, particularly actually from young female writers who write about this commitment phobes, you know, people, young men who won't commit. And of course, committing, saying, I will marry this woman, and I will, and if we have children, they will be my responsibility, and this will be an unqualified responsibility. They are my responsibility and nobody else's. This is the road to maturity for men. But our society makes that very difficult because of the things that you mentioned. The fact that young people are told, we're all told, not just young people, we're told that self-expression is the greatest good, that self-realization is the greatest good. But actually, I believe something quite different. I believe that the growth to full maturity can only be travelled by accepting responsibility. And accepting responsibility both for yourself and for those who are dependent upon you.
Yeah, and it also covers, I think, there's that classic psychology experiment with the children and the marshmallows, isn't there? Where they give children one marshmallow, say if you can not eat it while I go out the room, you can have two when I come back. And depending on whether the child eats it or not, you can tell how successful they may be later on in life, their ability to sacrifice for future gains. And it comes into the sexuality type thing. You know, the idea that sex is an itch which anyone can scratch. And why should I wait? Why should I hold back on those things? Let's indulge. And so as the price of sex, which may well used to have been a long-term commitment, that's now gone. So boys aren't expected, as you're touching on, to provide anything like that anymore. So relationships become much more vulnerable, much more loose, and that has its implications. So you came from a stable family background, and we've covered those influences very well. You then obviously you left home, you went into the higher education system, Tell us a little bit about that period of your life.
Well, I had a very false start with that. So I went to medical school and got thrown out after a couple of years. Because, as I said, I was...
Can you
when
tell
I was
us why? Was it
well,
legal?
when I was young and foolish, I was young and foolish, as I said. And so I mentioned the fact that I had disappointed my dad, particularly.
Yeah.
So this was a great disappointment for him, because they both rejoiced in the idea I'd become a doctor. But it didn't work out, and there were reasons for it. I was very young when I went to university. I was 17, and I wasn't disciplined enough. I had no self-discipline, and I wasn't able to do the necessary study.
Okay.
And medicine, particularly the way I was taught it in those days, was a massive learning by rote routine, and it wasn't for me. And so I failed at that badly. And which was, of course, a knock to my confidence, and also left me a bit at sea as to know what to do with myself. But that experience of failure, and then the realization which came in its train that I had to do something with my life to earn a living, meant I experimented with certain jobs. I tried banking for a little while, and various other things. But I had this idea that I wanted to, it came to me actually, that I'd like to do journalism. And so actually that's what I did. And I did it the very old-fashioned way, which was to do an apprenticeship. They were called indentures, with a local newspaper in the West Midlands, in Walsall, in fact, and which was also an education in itself, because I had been reared in Somerset.
Very different.
Very different. And so moving to the Black Country and actually getting to know the community and reporting on it, and getting to know the councillors, going in and out of people's houses to hear stories. This was a tremendous education for me, and opened my eyes to a different kind of life. And after that, various other journalistic jobs I did until I stayed in newspapers for a few years. Eventually went into radio and then into the BBC, which was where I spent the bulk of my career.
So how we, and this touches on the point of New Humanum, if you like, and the purpose of some of these discussions that we're having. How have we got to a position where largely the mainstream media seem to be socially liberal at a time when they have massive power to influence and exert, for example, and this of course is backed up or underpinned by the big tech, the social media companies who seem to also have a socially liberal preference. And then we end up with scenarios from a parliamentary perspective where the laws are made, for example, where I think it was October 2018, an anonymous Comres survey of MPs, over half of those who responded said they were too fearful to say what they really thought about certain issues. And you can then infer that they were also too fearful to vote in the way they felt they should vote, perhaps. Simply because they would be vilified on social media, vilified in the press, and probably be deselected next time election came around. So how have we, do you think, got to that position?
Well, I think there's one element of the explanation for that is that we are a more media-driven society than we were when I was young. And going back further, 100 years ago, I think the levers working on public opinion were fewer. They were in the hands of fewer people. Politicians, on the other hand, in those days, I think, saw themselves as more robustly independent, and the idea that we have a representative democracy, our MPs in those days felt that they were elected there to express their own views. And they weren't so bothered, actually, about the public pressure, if you like, coming from the media, because actually it didn't exist in the same way. Of course, there were other pressures. There were establishment pressures. I'm not saying it was, it was not a golden age, but some things were better. And I think there was a more robustly independent legislature. That is to say, it was less influenced by public opinion, less bothered about what the opinion polls were saying, less bothered about what the public media were saying. And of course, there was no social media as such. These days, when you read about the abuse that MPs come in for if they say the wrong thing, I mean, you'd have to be tough, wouldn't you, to stand up to that. And a lot of them, very understandably, prefer to go with the flow. It's not very courageous. They're not very brave, some of them. But I mean, I think that's why it's happened.
Yeah, it's funny. Roger Scruton, in his book, How to Be a Conservative, conservative with a small c, if you like, in chapter 3, he talks about civil society, and that civil society is developed from the ground up through family units and through social interaction, through churches, through regiments, through sport. And it's driven, and the purpose of government is to enable civil society to carry on with its kind of cross-evolved theory and thesis on how to self-develop and exist for its own sake. But we seem to have moved into a scenario now of top-down government which wants to correct and control civil society. So as opposed to things emerging, government enabling, we've now got government controlling, prescribing, people are having to abide and follow and go against many of their personal convictions, even to the degree of the dismantling of the family unit, and that being seen as actually not a bad thing at all.
No, quite. And some of the sharpest disputes revolve, don't they, around the use of language. So it has become all too obvious that government departments, many public bodies, are enthralled to organisations, campaigning organisations, which hold views which are quite at variance with the public's majority views. I'm thinking of Stonewall and the way that they have embedded themselves in these government departments. They're paid to do so. They have a direct input on policy. They change the way that the MOD, for instance, is the one I'm thinking of, because it was just in the newspapers this week, changing the language which internal documents use about men and women. The vexed question of pronouns and can I select my own pronoun. These things are, in my view, that they're in flight from reality. I mean, this is, I think, a kind of madness. But I think that those influences are changing society radically, and they're doing so without the assent of we the people. It's
well, you can see if you've got a socially liberal media and tech social culture that has the power to ruin people, cancel people, well, it's going to affect, apart from the very brave and the very dogged, it's going to affect what they say and what they feel and what they think from a public point of view. And the concept, because liberal, the idea of social liberal used to be a widely applauded thing. It meant live and let live. It meant, smallish governments in order to allow people to live their own lives how they want to live them, so long as they don't affect other people. That concept seems to have gone now. You can live and let live as long as you think and say the right things. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Just wondering, Robin, where do you see things going if they're not challenged?
I mean, what you've just been talking about in that question, what we've seen is the rise of the bigoted liberal. So the liberal bigot who, far from entertaining the idea of free speech, where people can, however much I dislike what you say, I will defend to the death your right to say it. That's gone completely out the window. Now it's been turned on its head. In fact, whatever, if you say something that I don't believe in, you will pay the penalty for that. And in current discourse, that's the cancel culture and all that.
And critical theory.
And critical, yes. So these things are oppressive and coercive. But I also think that this is a fragile construct, because you can intimidate and you can coerce and you can bully, but you cannot finally make people change what they feel in their hearts. And all those tens of millions of us who have strong reservations about the way that the transgender debate has gone, we will have our day too, because in that particular instance, what is being proposed, the majority of us think is a nonsense, a flight from reality. It doesn't accord with our experience of life. And also it has practical dangers, that some of these changes which are proposed have practical consequences for other people, which will be unpleasant and negative. And I think that there's a sort of analogy here with what happened in Brexit, for instance, because it was very clear to me as a reporter for many years, before a suggestion that we should have an in-out referendum. It was clear to me that in many parts of the country there were large numbers of people who thought ill of the EU and didn't want any part of it. And eventually, as we know...
The EU, not Europe. Now.
Yeah, exactly.
Very, very different.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's any... I've never detected any animosity towards Europeans in Britain. But it was always there, this kind of resistance to the idea of being governed by these foreign people about whom we knew nothing and had no opportunity to elect in Brussels. Why were we doing that? There was this feeling. And eventually, what happened, as we all know now, political circumstances conspired and Cameron granted the referendum, and then then we left. And the day will come, I'm certain of it, when some of these fanciful notions which are espoused by social liberals will be put to the test, and there will be a change. But, can I see that happening? At the moment, the problem is that all the levers, all the power is in the hands of social liberals. There isn't a mainstream media organisation in the country of any national stature which is socially conservative.
So I was going to interject there with the potential exception of GB News. What's your view about that?
So, yes, I mean, with the exception of GB News. But GB News is at the moment a niche player.
It is.
It has to be said. It hasn't got a huge audience. But the idea, but what that shows is that media men who are interested in making a profit will follow an audience, and so that should give us hope.
I like your earlier kind of analogy with things that have happened in the near past, because there are other analogies you could draw. I mean, have there been other occasions where sex has been trivialized, where the state takes responsibility for children, for example, where the state has ultimate control over its people. Within the last 100 years or so, we've seen that happen in other places, haven't we?
We certainly have.
And the consequences have been more death than
Yes.
all the wars put together that have ever occurred.
Yes.
So it hasn't always worked out too well.
It
And
hasn't.
There's something of the feel of, yeah, but they didn't quite do it right. If we could just have another go,
Yes.
we might get it right this time.
Well, I mean, because the analogy, atheistic communism, and the way that it constructed the society, which banished God and relegated to the dustbin all the traditional notions of morality, turned out to be a ghastly mistake. I mean, it's very interesting that in the 1920s, after the communists came to power in in Russia, and in that first early period, the early communists were very taken with the idea of free love, and they abolished it was men and women were encouraged to throw off as it was seen, the shackles of marriage, the shackles of family, and to do it as often as they wished, with whomever they wished, and go hang the consequences. Now, it's very interesting that within a decade, the Communist Party actually rode back on that, because the social chaos which ensued was devastating for Russian society. And actually, by the 1930s and going into the 1940s and 50s, actually Soviet communism became quite prudish in terms of, certainly in its approach to sex, which isn't to say that it was, that was just one aspect of Soviet communism of the time. But what that episode shows is the way in which we discard these ideas, these God-given rules about the way we should relate to each other and the way we should live our lives as men and women. We discard these at our peril. And once you do discard them, the personal consequences are, for many millions of people, are disastrous. They create pain and heartbreak, and they ruin lives, and they deny children what should be the proper legacy for any child. So much of social policy in this country is directed at trying to make up for the inadequacies of the family situation into which children are born. You've got this whole panoply of social welfare systems which are supposed to compensate for the breakdown of the family. And good people try their hardest to make those systems work, but there is no substitute for the solid foundation of the loving care of parents and the stable family situation. It is essential for healthy society.
And the international body of research supports that quite clearly and unequivocally.
Absolutely unequivocally.
But it's interesting because, of course, research, data, logic, Helen Pluckrose makes the point in her book Cynical Theories that the problem is we're in an age where those things, if I can use the complicated word epistemology, the definition of truth, has now changed. So evidence, truth, logic, they're not applied anymore. No. They don't mean anything.
No.
So how do we approach dealing with a situation where you can't deal with it from the point of view of fact or evidence or logic or sense? It's all about what I feel. How do you approach dealing with that?
It is a tragic irony in some ways that some of the loudest voices in the media lament what they call the post-truth age and fake news. And these are the very organs of opinion which, exactly as you say, ignore the evidence of what happens when we stray from these ideas. I mean, it's
just to kind of draw something out of you, because the problem as I see it, Robin, is that there's a very thin line between, say, for example, vaccine passports to protect your physical health and thought passports to protect your mental health or other people's. You can't come in here if you have those views, because you're likely to damage somebody's mental health. And the line is very thin between those two things, and we really don't want to go there, in my opinion. So I'm just wondering what, in your experience and your understanding of wider society and your view across the decades of how it's developed, from the inside as well as now on the outside, what would you advise? Where do we go?
I mean, to me, as a Catholic and a practicing Christian, the answer isn't that hard to find. You know, I mean, I believe that personal growth towards a full maturity involves self-discipline and self-restraint. This is quite a difficult message to sell in a society which values the exact opposite.
Self-indulgence.
Self-indulgence.
Complete lack of restraint.
And this complete lack. In fact, you know, this is seen actually as a virtue. But I think what you have to remember, Tony, I think is that the cumulative evidence of societal breakdown, of family breakdown, for instance, the truly tragic toll which knife crime among young gang members in London has taken in recent years.
Yep.
You know, that is a symptom of something which has gone wrong, and you know, those sorts of symptoms are crying out for examination and remedy. And I think, you know, you and I would agree that the remedy is to return to a more traditional path.
Well, it's roots rather than fruits. 20,000 police officers may well deal with the results of the crime, but 20,000 fathers staying at home raising their children may well stop the crimes happening in the first place.
Indeed.
You know?
Indeed.
But how do we engage in that dialogue with a society that really kind of sees it as anathema?
Well, you can only do it. You know, you can only do it by personal witness, in a sense. So try to lead good lives. And I should say, obviously, I don't. You know, perhaps it shouldn't need saying, but I will say it anyway. That I'm not holding myself up as an exemplar. You know, I'm not perfect, and nobody that I know is perfect. And in fact, trying to live up to the beliefs that I hold is a thorny path, and it's not easy. And which is why it's a difficult message to sell, because this is a message which runs counter to human nature in certain respects. But although to curb one's own natural desire for more sex, more drink, more food, more property, more money, to curb one's natural appetite for these things seems to be counterintuitive, doesn't it? But actually, that it's only through restraining those natural appetites that we arrive at something which can be called full maturity. And this is... So how do we get that message across? Well, you know, what we're doing now in its small...
in its small contribution.
in its small... Because you know, these messages, these things we're talking about, and these things we're saying, we hope, you know, like the parable of the sower in the Bible, you know, most of this seed will fall on stony ground, but some of it will fall into the ear of the person who is ready to listen, and then may be intrigued by this idea, and it'll bear fruit. That's the point. And of course, you know, the whole of discourse in a society like ours is a matter of contesting the argument, and the argument which changes day by day, year by year, but there is always the contest going on. The battle between ideas is one which never ends. And at the moment, we're living in an age when a certain set of liberal values is very much in the ascendant. And our values seem to be in retreat.
It's interesting how the argument goes that's changed in some other areas. So take the argument around abortion in the US. Now, opinions seem to be changing much more towards the pro-life debate. And one of the simple arguments around that is, well, pro-lifers have more children. It's quite simple. And so over time, it'll work itself out.
Yes.
And you've got to wonder to what degree things will eventually burn themselves out. Because actually, coming from I never knew my father, but now I live in a wonderful family with a lovely wife, happily married, and 4 children, most of whom are grown up. And there's nothing more delightful to me than being in that environment. And hopefully from a kind of almost market principles perspective, the majority of people will think, hold on, I don't want to have this disconnected, loose life which is based on trivial relationships and all sorts of nonsense like that. I'm more than my sexuality. I'm deeper than that. And my depth requires these permanent long-term connections with these people that love me.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, you mentioned the abortion debate in the US, and the thing about the US and that particular issue is they do have a proper debate, and we don't, And I've often said and often thought that what we lack in this country is a proper culture war. We don't have a culture war because, in fact, all we hear from our mainstream media is a uniform message on some of these very important issues. There is, the BBC no longer even makes any attempt to have an even, balanced debate on something like abortion. As far as they're concerned, it's not an issue. And the issue has been decided, and it's been decided in favour of universal access to easy abortion.
Yeah. And this is the correct view and the right view.
Yes.
Irrespective of whether or not half the country or more have an opposing view.
Yes.
They're clearly wrong.
Yes.
Which is quite interesting.
And in America, of course, the situation is different because there, I think because of the vigour of the Christian churches, the more, in some ways, more fragmented and more open US media. Certainly since, one thing which is very germane to this is what happened in the 1990s with the cable networks and the original emergence of Fox. So the idea that, and let's be honest, Murdoch wasn't doing this because he's a sainted individual. He did it because he realised there was a massive audience which was getting a message which it didn't agree with. Fox has now become a very successful organisation, as we know, and it reaches an audience. As one of Fox's competitors, a senior executive, once quipped to the head of Fox. He said, "You found the perfect niche market. 50% of the population." and there's huge truth in that, which is why GB News is nowhere near that at the moment, and doesn't. But the point is that if once an organisation could gather strength and vigour and become an organisation which reflected those views we're talking about, it would change the picture. But at the moment, we don't have that. We've just got. We've got left and further left and left and left now. You've got BBC, you've got ITN, you've got Channel 4, etc.
Although, ironically, I do my bit in trying to follow people with a very different perspective to me on social media and stuff, and I often see them criticising the BBC for being a right-wing organisation. Now, I don't know if they're doing that as a way of just intentionally adding balance, or whether they really believe that. I don't know. That's quite, or whether it's just all a matter of perception.
In ordinary political discourse, all right-wing, when the term right-wing is used, it generally is used by people, and its meaning is people we don't like, views we don't like. It has no meaning in terms of, it's not as if there is, what is right-wing, particularly about wanting stable families? Is that a right-wing position?
And we take words like racism, like Nazi, and we fill them with loose meanings that actually degrade the words themselves.
Absolutely.
You know, and the idea that you're not allowed, if you disagree with me, you disagree with my views, it means you've got some kind of phobia. It means you've got some kind of hatred. Unless you agree and celebrate my views, whatever they may be, then you must hate me and you must hate everybody like me. Which is almost, it's a caricature, isn't it, of emotional behaviour, and it's a ridiculous caricature. We need to draw back to common sense discourse, if you like.
Absolutely, and it is said, I don't know if this is 100% accurate, but I've certainly read that the word Islamophobia was a construct dreamt up by the Muslim Brotherhood as a way of demonizing those people who might have had reservations about Islam. So, the word Islamophobia is bandied around now, and it's applied to anybody who has, a criticism, whether valid or not, of Islam. And that's a way of, it's not engaging with the debate, it's a way of silencing and demonizing your opponent, which they've done very effectively.
I like to use the analogy of cauliflower, because I really can't stand cauliflower at all. But some of the people I love the most really enjoy eating it. I haven't got a problem with that. We have differences, and we should be able to live in a society where we can accept other people's views and differences, and get on with life. And it really doesn't matter. The problem comes if you tell me, actually, carrots are now cauliflower, and you must therefore eat cauliflower thinking they're carrots. Hold on, we've got a confusion in society here, and that seems to be where we're going, which is
even worse, they might say to you, well, you've got to eat cauliflower and you've got to like it.
And you've got to praise it.
You've got to praise it.
In terms of people getting up and getting involved, I wonder what your views are on people re-engaging with civil society. I'm conscious that, so for example, in local constituency areas, not everyone can stand to be an MP or a councillor, I get that. But actually, in terms of local constituency areas, there's a very small number of people often decide who the candidates are, etc., etc. And perhaps we need more people to engage with that kind of process. Bring along 2 or 3 of your friends, join whichever political party you want to, turn up to the local constituency, pick the candidates that you think are going to say the things that you want to hear said.
I think that's a wholly laudable thing to do, and it would be a good thing if more people did it. But I also think that that politics can be a very rough game.
Yep.
And if you're going to involve yourself in politics, I have only once ever dipped a toe into the political pond, and only for a bit of fun. But whether I'd want to actually involve myself wholly in it, would be another matter. What I do know, Tony, is this, that I had some experience starting and running a charity. And one of the things that proved to me was that there is an enormous reservoir of well-intentioned people who want to do the right thing and will give of their time and effort and money to do the right thing. And so this should be something which should give us great heart, because it's easy to look across the cultural the cultural frontier
Mm.
and think everything is lost, it's all awful, and we're losing, and we'll go on losing. Actually, I remain optimistic because I think that as I say, most people want to do the right thing, and given the opportunity to hear the right message, things can be turned around.
Mm.
I'm not for a moment suggesting that it's going to be easy or quick, but I do believe I think in the long term, society will return to its senses.
Mm. And I think that's a key point, because the social change we've seen, the dramatic social change, has occurred really over about a 40 to 50 year period, which is a tiny, tiny blip in the big scheme of things. And things change, and there would be that encouragement, I suppose, for everyone to calmly, gently speak your mind, make your opinion known, write to your MP regularly, respond to newspaper articles. If it's your thing to ring into phone-ins, do that or something. But just make your voice be heard.
Yes, a sort of low-level social activism where you just say your piece and stick to your principles.
And even, as you say, get engaged in civil society yourself. Join a charity, join a health board, apply for a governorship in your school or something.
Yes.
You know, get into situations, decisions are made by the people in the room.
Yes.
Get in the room.
Yes.
You know?
And I agree with all that. And I devoutly hope that that's what's going to happen.
Well, I think these series of interviews hopefully will contribute to that. Robin Aitken, you've certainly contributed in your work for the BBC. You're publishing since the BBC. Can I recommend your book, The Noble Liar? It really is a succinct explanation of so much which is happening in society, which so many other books take a lot longer to say, I might add. And yours deals with them very, very well, so I'd like to recommend that. Thank you for your time today, and all the very best for the future.
Thank you.